Hey guys, hope you had a good weekend. So you're getting the computer screen again today. We're going to talk about poetry starting this week. I know we did a little bit back when we were in school, and we did some out of our book, analyzed a few, but I want to get a little bit more in depth with it, give you some terms to go over. I know I put some on the board, but this is just, and I have posted this link on Classroom. This is just a review of those in a setting where we're just focusing on this rather than kind of tacking it on at the end of a class. We're going to go over some poems today. I'll pull some from your book as we do this section. Sometimes I'll get them offline. Today I've taken two offline. One I'll analyze for you in this video, and the other is going to be homework. But there's no vocab for today. We'll get back to that tomorrow. So you should have plenty of time to do it. It's not terribly difficult. Reasonably short poem. All right. So, and again, I've posted this link that we're currently looking at on Google Classroom, so please take a look at that. Some of these terms are really important, some are not as much for you guys, and I'll try to point out which ones I care about and which ones I don't. So, we're talking about the structure of poetry in this section. Stanza is very important, that first term. So, several lines of poetry grouped together with white space above and below, similar to a paragraph in fiction, okay? This is what if you look at a poem and it looks like it's separated out into paragraphs, like there's white space in the middle, that's what white space means, a big gap right there. Those are stanzas when we're talking about poetry, okay? Whereas if we were reading an essay or a story, we would say, okay, that's a paragraph. In this case, it's called a stanza. And a line, obviously, is just one line. Like that would be a line if this were a poem. Um, so when you group lines together and you separate them with white space, it would be called a stanza. So a couplet is a pretty common type of stanza. It's two lines that stand alone. So it's a two-line stanza, okay? A four-line stanza, which I'm not sure is on here. No, it's not. It's called a quatrain. I'll type that right here so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so quatrain, a stanza of four lines. Google's smart. So it's a four-line stanza. Those are the two that I'd really like you to know. There are lots of other lengths of stanzas of various different lines. There are names for 3 lines, 5 lines, 6 lines, and all of that. I'm not super concerned with you knowing those, but I would like you to know couplet and quatrain because they're the most common. So couplet, couple, 2. Quatrain, that quad part of it, 4. Okay. Soliloquy, I'm not super worried about. If you want to know what that is, you can look at it, but that's more important in theater and things, and it's not really going to be very important in the poetry we look at. Meter is the next thing I want us to notice. So meter is the rhythmic structure of the poem, the way it sounds. This is dealing with how many syllables you have in a line and how they're stressed. I'm not worried about stressed or emphasized at the 6th grade level. I'm not great with, the iambs and trochaic and all that different things, which sounds like Latin to you because it is. So don't worry about those. With meter, all I really want you focusing on is how many syllables are in a line. Okay. And I'll talk about that more when we get to the examples, but I want you to focus on recognizing lengths of lines, like number of syllables per line. When they talk about iambic pentameter down here, they're talking about a specific type of meter. Penta, you should probably know from like pentagon in math, means 5. So when it's pentameter, it's 5 something in a meter. It's actually 10 syllables though. So whenever you have a prefix like this, it's whatever the prefix is times 2. So if you had trimeter, which tri is 3, like tricycle, it would be 3 times 2, it would be 6 syllables per line, okay? That you do not have to worry about. I'm never going to ask you, hey, tell me it's pentameter or tetrameter or anything like that. All I'm going to ask is how many syllables are there in each line? Does it have the same number of syllables per line? If it does, then it has a meter. If it's got like 6 in one line, 13 in the next, 8 in the next, 4 in the next, then it doesn't have meter. So I just want you to be able to recognize whether it does or doesn't have meter and be able to count syllables in a line. That's not too difficult. All right, so types of poetry. This is something I would like you to know. So free verse is something that we'll look at a little bit. I'm probably not going to start you off with it. Free verse doesn't necessarily have meter or rhyme scheme. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but most of the time it's kind of all over the place. And it's really hard to distinguish from prose, which is just regular writing. I've told you guys anything that's not poetry is prose, anything that's not prose is poetry. That's not a great definition, but it's about as good as it gets because sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. With free verse poetry, it can be really hard to tell the difference. If I give you a free verse poem that's a page long and I ask you whether it's a poem or a story, it might be kind of hard to tell. So what you're looking for is that logic that poetry has. Poetry doesn't necessarily follow your real world logic. If I open the door and I walk out to the mailbox and I get the mail. That's real world logic. If I open the door, fall down, turn into a flower, that's poetry logic, right? The logic of dreams, that whole I'm trying to run from something, but my feet are suddenly concrete idea. That's kind of what poetry usually follows, and that's not a hard rule either. Sometimes poetry is very logical in real world, which again makes this difficult. But I will tell you for sure if we're dealing with a poem or not. And if we're dealing with a poem that doesn't have rhyme scheme or meter at all, you can say for sure that it is free verse. Blank verse is somewhat similar. It doesn't have rhyme, but it has meter. So it'll have a set number of syllables per line, or a set pattern of syllables, like it might go 8 5 8 5 8 5, something like that. And that would be blank verse if it doesn't rhyme, but it does have meter. Now you can have poems that rhyme but don't have meter, but that's a little bit easier to identify. Narrative poems. So we'll read some of these. I think we've read some in class. We've talked about them. And this is again where poems and prose can be kind of similar and difficult to tell apart. Poems can tell stories. What it talks about here with epics and ballads, if you've ever heard of any of the ancient Greek epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the Roman Aeneid, or Aeneid, depending on your pronunciation, those are really, really long poems, like over 500 pages long. I want to say the Iliad's about 700 or 800 pages. And they tell stories. They tell really long stories. But back in that day, people didn't write novels. They didn't write long works of prose. They wrote these things as poems because they wanted it to sound kind of like a chant, so it would be able to be memorized. Something that rhymes, you guys probably know, is easier to memorize. These people didn't necessarily write down all their stuff, so they would memorize these really, really long poems to tell their stories in, because it was easier to memorize. It was easier to hand down orally through speech. So that's where you get these really long narrative poems, but there are still short narrative poems, and people still write narrative poems today. A poem can tell a story, absolutely doesn't have to. But I do want you to know and be able to identify a narrative poem, blank verse, free verse, sonnets. So a sonnet is a 14-line poem. That's all you need to know. This was really common for Shakespeare. He wrote most of his poems and sonnets. He wrote a long series of sonnets, and he wrote them in iambic pentameter. His were really, really strict as far as rhyme scheme and meter. He would have 3 quatrains followed by 1 couplet. So that's 4 4 4 2 as far as the way his stanzas were set up. That's 14 total lines, and his every time went A B C D C D E F G G. That was his rhyme scheme all the way down. You do not have to be able to identify all of that. You don't have to be able to tell me about the pentameter or Shakespeare or anything else. I might give you a Shakespeare poem, or I might analyze one on video for you, just to let you look at it. But all I want you to know is that a sonnet's a 14-line poem. That is something I want you to know. If you see a poem and it looks like it's around 14 lines, count them, because I want you to be able to tell me whether it's a sonnet or not. Elegy, I'm not worried about you really knowing that right now. It's usually a sad poem, something you might write about someone who's died, like at a funeral. You might hear an elegy read or something. A really sad song could be called an elegy, because as you guys should know, songs are poems set to music. But yeah, if you don't know what an elegy is, I'm not terribly worried about it. Poetic techniques, I want you to know about these. So alliteration is one that I want you to know. This is a good example of it. It's where you have a consonant sound repeated at the start of words, like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. I'm not saying that any faster, so don't ask. That's alliteration. We notice how the P is bolded here. It's the repetition of a consonant sound. It creates a rhythm. A lot of nursery rhyme type things use this. The opposite of that, which is not listed on here, is assonance, and I'm not typing that into the search bar for obvious reasons, because I don't know what would pop up as a suggested search. But it's the repetition of vowel sounds. Like if I said, only once one went, I can't come up with another rhyme for it, but that w sound at the front, that O or W sound is repeated. That's a very strong vowel sound. If you have that vowel repetition, that's called assonance. And it's very similar to alliteration. It just creates a rhythm. Onomatopoeia, you should know, but I'm not necessarily going to ask you about it. It's where you've got words like meow and oink that represent a sound and also kind of sound like the sound, like buzz is a common one, bang, pop, click. Those are called onomatopoeias. It's words for sounds that sound like the actual sound they're talking about. Consonants is basically the same thing as alliteration. It's just where the consonants can show up inside the word rather than just at the front. I'm not worried about you knowing about consonants. If you call consonants alliteration, I'll tell you you're fine. Oh, personification. So personification is something I would like you to know about. This is where you take an object or an animal and you give it human qualities. I've seen this called the pathetic fallacy as well, but you don't have to know that. This is where it gives an example of William Blake. It says, "Ah, William, we're weary of weather," said the sunflower shining with dew. Sunflowers can't talk. They can't be weary or anything like that. They don't feel emotion, they don't think, they don't talk. So when you give these thoughts or feelings in a poem to an animal or an object or a plant, that's personification, okay? Which is making it like a person, personification. Pretty simple. All right, so rhyme scheme. What we are worried about is end rhyme primarily. I might point out if we see internal rhyme in a poem, I mean, you can point it out if you'd like, but I'm probably not going to ask you to notice internal rhyme a lot. It gives an example from Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, which is a very famous poem. It says, "Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary." That's one line. I know it doesn't look like one because of the way the spacing is on this page, but weary and dreary are within the same line. They rhyme. I'm not worried about that when we talk about rhyme scheme. When we talk about rhyme scheme, I'm talking about end rhyme. Okay, so the very last sound, the last syllable in a word, that's what I'm worried about. So if we say roses are red, violets are blue, he chopped my head and cut it in two. So roses are red. Red is A because it's our first sound. Violets are blue. So blue is B, okay, because that's our second sound. Red and blue don't rhyme. Red, blue, A, B. He chopped my head. Head rhymes with red, so that's another A. And cut it in two. Two rhymes with blue, so that's another B. So A, B, A, B. That's our rhyme scheme for that goofy little poem. And yes, I did come up with that spontaneously. You're welcome. So that should be pretty straightforward, I would think. I don't think you'll have too many difficulties with the rhyme scheme. Really quickly, I'm going to pull one up and we're going to look at it. So this is an Edgar Allan Poe poem, the guy who wrote The Raven that we just talked about for a second. It's called A Dream Within a Dream. I'll read it really quickly, and then I'm just going to talk a little bit about rhyme scheme and meter. We notice right away that it's two stanzas because we've got that one white space in the middle. Okay, and I can't highlight this because it is an image. "Take this kiss upon the brow, and in parting from you now, thus much let me avow, you are not wrong who deem that my days have been a dream. Yet if hope has flown away, in a night or in a day, in a vision or in none, is it therefore the less gone? All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. I stand amid the roar of a surf-tormented shore, and I hold within my hand grains of the golden sand. How few, yet how they creep through my fingers to the deep, while I weep, while I weep. O God, can I not grasp them with a tighter clasp? O God, can I not save one from the pitiless wave? Is all that we see or seem." All right, and I believe that's actually a little bit longer. I believe it's supposed to have but a dream within a dream again at the bottom. But anyway, they might have cut that line off on this picture of it. So first thing we notice, these first three lines, brow, now, avow, those three rhyme. So we've got A, deem, dream, B, away, day, C, none, gone. Not a perfect rhyme, but it's close enough. It's what I'd call partial rhyme. So D, seem, dream, E. So just analyzing that first stanza, there's a pretty clear rhyme scheme. Okay. If we go to the second one, roar, shore, hand, sand, creep, deep, weep, grasp, clasp, save, wave, seem, and I believe, like I said, dream should be there again. So it's pretty much every two lines rhyme with one another. So we've got a series of 2 by 2 all the way down, except for occasionally there's 3, like at the beginning here, and then creep, deep, weep, there's 3. But it's a pretty strict rhyme scheme. It sticks to what it's doing. So if we count the syllables, I'll just do the first few lines to see if there is one. So take this kiss upon the brow, so that's 7, and in parting from you now, 7, thus much let me avow, 6, so it's pretty close. And that dash, that pause at the end of the third line, I would say is supposed to be a silent syllable, so it's probably 7 all the way. You are not wrong who deem that my days have been a dream. So it's 6 or 7 all the way down. So that's got meter, definitely. Relatively strict meter. I would say with pauses like the comma and the M dash here, he's aiming for some silent syllables in there. So I would say he's probably got 7 roughly all the way through the whole poem. So he's sticking with a strict meter of 7 syllables per line. He's got a pretty strict rhyme scheme. So that's pretty simple and straightforward. Now this poem, I will share a link to. It's very short. It's Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. It's another very famous poem, very famous American poet. So, and you'll read a lot of him in high school, most likely. You'll probably encounter this poem again at some point. So, what I want us to do, I'm not going to ask you about the meaning of it or anything. I didn't talk about the meaning of Dream Within a Dream either. So, all I'm looking for today is for you to tell me how many stanzas does this poem have? Hint, that's a really, really easy one. And I am going to type up the question when I post the poem. How many lines? Okay, another really easy thing. What's the rhyme scheme, if any? What's the meter, if any? And I believe that's it. Okay, so stanzas, lines, rhyme scheme, meter. That's all I'm asking you about today. Should be pretty straightforward. Um, I might ask you about meaning of poems and stuff later on as we go through this. Again, we'll do another poem probably for the next few days. We're going to get back in some Unit 12 vocab again tomorrow. But it should be a pretty straightforward week. Let me know if you have any questions about any of the poetry terms or anything else. If you're confused by rhyme scheme and meter, let me know. But make sure you do read over the terms that I posted and look at this video again if you're confused. Because I think it's pretty well explained. But again, if you just cannot get it, then email me, message me on Classroom, and I'll try to explain. All right, see you guys.